So I'll just start with a short opening karakia. E te hui, whaia te mātauranga, kia marama, kia whai take ngā mahi katoa, tūmaia, tūkaha, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia, tātou katoa. I honour the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, place of my birth. I pay respects to ancestors and elders, past and present, and offer respect to ngā iwi Māori and the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai. Hello and welcome to our panellists and all you members of the audience. It's great to see you. This is a kind of special collaborative binational New Zealand Society of Authors Otapoti Dunedin branch Salon and celebrating the verse novel. And I think by verse novel, we mean verse novel generally, but also specifically the book, The Verse Novel, Australia and New Zealand, which is the most recent publication by this evening's moderator, Linda Weste, who we welcome from Melbourne. Linda is a poet, reviewer and editor. Her historical verse novel, Nothing Sacred, won the Wesley Michael Wright Prize. She's published 2 non-fiction collections of interviews with writers about verse novel poetics and researched verse novels for her PhD in creative writing from the University of Melbourne, where she teaches poetry and poetics. The verse novel, Australia and New Zealand, contains 35 interviews with verse novelists writing for children's, young adult and adult categories, and included among the interviewees are 2 of our panellists tonight, John Newton and Diane Brown, who I'm sure are known to many of you. So I'll just give a very brief introduction of all the panellists, who in addition to Linda, Diane and John include Harry Ricketts and Joan Fleming. And then I'm going to hand over to Linda, who will take over from there. So Diane Brown, one of our local Otapoti Dunedin authors, author of 2 poetry books, Before the Divorce We Go to Disneyland and Learning to Lie Together, the novel If the Tongue Fits, a travel memoir, Liars and Lovers, a prose poetic work, Here Comes Another Vital Moment, a poetic memoir, Taking My Mother to the Beach, Taking My Mother to the Opera, and a poetic novella, her most recent book, Every Now and Then I Have Another Child. Diane's book, 8 Stages of Grace, is widely regarded as the first full-length verse novel published in Aotearoa. We welcome Joan Fleming, who is also joining us from Melbourne, and whose latest book is Song of Less, a verse novel exploring ritual, taboo, and the limits of individualism in the ruins of ecological collapse. Joan is the author of the poetry collections The Same as Yes and Failed Love Poems, and the pamphlets True Dreams in Which Things Are Taken and Some People's Favourites. She holds a PhD in ethnopoetics from Monash University, and her manuscript Dirt was recently shortlisted for the Helen Ann Bell Poetry Bequest. Joan teaches creative writing for Massey University, and in 2023 will return to Te Whanganui Atara. John Newton, welcome John, also a local poet and a literary historian, and formerly a lecturer in the English department at the University of Canterbury, and before that at the University of Melbourne, where he did his PhD. His non-fiction books are The Double Rainbow, a study of James K. Baxter's Jerusalem Commune, Hard Frost, Structures of Feeling in New Zealand Literature, 1908 to 1945, and Liu Summers, Body and Soul. John's published 3 volumes of poetry, and most recently a verse novel, Escape, Path, Lightning. He also moonlights as a musician and plays in his alt country band, the Overdogs. And Harry Ricketts, last but not least, a poet, biographer, essayist, and professor emeritus in the English program at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. He's published around 30 books and is an admirer of verse novels, from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Lee to Dorothy Porter's The Monkey's Mask. He's written a verse novel / sequence of poems about an imaginary German to New Zealand poet, Stella. So welcome everybody. And Just letting you all know there will be time for questions and conversation at the end. So store up any comments or questions that you have, but we'll try to keep the session flowing so that we can get through everything and hear as much as we can from our panelists. So now I offer a very warm welcome to Linda from across the Tasman, and it's with delight that I hand over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm joining you from Naarm, Melbourne, and would like firstly to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the ongoing struggles for justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia, and that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge all Indigenous Maori, tangata whenua, of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and your Pacifica whanau. I acknowledge your rich culture and languages and ancestral, spiritual, and continuing connections to land and sea. Anna Seward's Louisa, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, Emily Bronte's Gondal's Queen, Alexander Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, Vikram Seth's The Golden Gate. Each of these works tells a story in poetry, yet each has reached its readership cloaked in a different guise. Anna Seward in 1784 chose poetical novel to subtitle her four verse epistles Louisa. In the early 19th century, Emily Bronte subtitled her manuscript of Gondal's Queen, a novel in verse. Pushkin chose novel in verse too, once his serialized chapters of Eugene Onegin were united in 1833. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was intent on writing a novel poem, but published Aurora Leigh, a poem, in 1856. And a leap in time to 1986 and Vikram Seth, who emulates Pushkin's elaborate poetic style, writing in Onegin stanzas, however, subtitles his The Golden Gate with a novel. Tonight in Storytelling Through Poetry, we continue this encounter with stories in poetry that come to us cloaked in a range of guises. Verse novels, poetic novella, poem sequence, novel. These variations in nomenclature prompt us to consider their literary reception by asking, what's in a name? Now, John, although your escape path lighting most closely adheres to a poetic meter, it's subtitled a novel, and Joan, your work has no subtitle, though you refer to Song of Less as a verse novel. And Diane, you've published a verse novel, 8 Stages of Grace, though your latest work, Every Now and Then I Have Another Child, is a poetic novella. So John, Joan, Diane, can each of you in turn briefly convey what influenced your decision about how to title and or subtitle your stories in poetry? Over to John.
Just unmute yourself, John.
Right again. Thanks, Linda. I think it was. I mean, I put the novel thing up front. I think sort of partly out of cheek in a way. I mean, I wanted to sort of take the novel, you know, the confront the sort of narrative dimension sort of head on, and you know, write something that wasn't a sequence of loosely connected lyrics, that wasn't, you know, sort of, you know, vaguely sort of narrative, something that really did have, you know, a big cast of characters and in which something happened. So, you know, I suppose, I mean, I was trying to make it as novelistic as I possibly could. And so that I think is why I put it up front. I think I also wanted self-consciously, I imagined my little CV and this list of titles, and I wanted something out there that didn't look like a volume of poems. So if it said, you know, escape lighting, a novel, it would look like something different on my list of publications. That's probably about as much as I can say about that.
Kia ora tātou, everybody, and ngā mihi nui to NZSA Ōtepoti branch for putting this on, and thank you to Linda Weste for holding space for us. I'm tuning in from Wurundjeri country, where I'm happy to be a guest. And yeah, to answer the question of what influenced the titling of Song of Less, my publisher, Kent McCarter from Cordite Books, did have another title in mind that was far longer and kind of more linguistically dense. He was pushing quite hard for it, and it sort of spoke to the elements of the book that are to do with hallucination and taboo. He didn't win. And I mean, my experience of titling a book is kind of being 2 weeks out from going to print, and, you know, waking up in the middle of the night and running out into the moonlight and rending my tunics over which title is the best. And then when it arrives and you're set on it, you know, it couldn't never be anything else. But Song of Less, I mean, this is a book that came out of a period of intense kind of grief and anguish in coming to terms with the fact that as a species, we largely failed in our responsibility to disarm the climate that we've weaponized. And yeah, I think I was meditating on what a future of diminishment, of extreme diminishment would look like and feel like. And the characters in this book are, you know, living in an extremely diminished time where there's very little to provide sustenance and pleasure, and there's no future. So that's the kind of the context that it's coming out of. So finding a phrase to sum up everything about the book that I wanted to convey is, you know, one of those impossible decisions. But yeah, Song of Less felt like the thing. And, you know, less is not necessarily a bad thing. So there's pleasures in less. Yeah, I'll pass it on to Diane.
Thanks, Joan. Wasn't quite sure whether you're talking about what category or what genre these works are supposed to be called. I think when my first book came out, 8 Stages of Grace, the publisher didn't really want me to write a verse novel. I had a lot of pushback from publishers. My first publisher said, if only we could wean you off poetry, and really didn't want to know about it. So it was sort of like, went under the radar a little bit, except it does say on the back cover that it is a verse novel. And then I felt even more pushback in a way with my latest book, Every Now and Then I Have Another Child, which I really do think of as a novella, probably, because it's quite short, but it's got all the novel elements of characters and plot and all of that sort of thing. But the publisher who was Otago Uni, who said we don't want to call it a verse novella because we don't publish fiction. So it was basically let's pretend this is just a long poem, a narrative poem. So it doesn't say anything anywhere about exactly what it is. Oh, on the cover it just says a poetic narrative. If we're talking about the titles of my books, they're quite sort of definite sort of titles, and I cannot write a book unless I have a title first. So I have to, I come up with a title and then the rest falls into place, even if I have no idea what I'm actually going to write about. If I've got the title, I'm okay.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, look, this question of nomenclature, clearly there are reservations held by publishers and readers about poetic stories. And these, you know, are cause for thought. But there's also a renewed interest in verse novels, which you know, arguably affords an opportunity to amplify significant verse works, perhaps including Alastair Te Ariki Campbell's 72-poem Mauru Battalion, a poetic sequence, published in 2001, Robert Sullivan's 2002 book-length narrative poem, Captain Cook in the Underworld, and the 2009 epic in verse, The Adventures of Ella by Albert Wendt. Now, among recent researchers to trace this and related genealogy of New Zealand's long poems is Irene Beautray. Now, Harry, you supervised Irene's doctoral research. So my next question is directed to you and draws on your views of literary reception. In your view, Harry, to what extent have literary trends in New Zealand engaged with verse novels, these poem sequences, book-length narrative works?
Harry, just unmute, please. Yeah.
Muted again. Sorry, tēnā koutou, thanks. I'm just going to give you a very quick sprint answer. You're quite right, I did supervise Irene, and she wrote a brilliant PhD, which I recommend, called Narrativity and Segmentivity in Contemporary Australian and New Zealand Long Poems and Poem Sequences. But I'll just very quickly run through. So verse epics, well, there are really only two obvious verse epics. One is Alfred Dommett's vast, unreadable Ranulph and Amohia, published in 1872. It's longer than Paradise Lost, and I only know one person who's ever finished it. But Albert Wendt's very readable The Adventures of Vela that you mentioned, Linda, 2009, that's well worth reading, and that, amongst much else, threads together stories of this Samoan songmaker Vela and the warrior goddess Nafanua. One might also mention Tusiata Avia's Blood Clot, 2009, which also makes use of the myth of Nafanua and uses it as a frame for a version of her own story, and perhaps Esame Ranapiri's Echidna, which was published this year, and that mashes up Greek and Maori mythology and puts it in kind of modern day New Zealand. So not much on the verse epics. So many narrative poems, I can't begin to kind of list them. But verse novels, yes, Diane Brown's excellent 8 Stages of Grace, that can rightly claim to be the first. A few other examples might include Anne Kennedy's 2 collections, Sing Song 2003, which is about a mother's tortured attempts to find a cure for her daughter's chronic eczema, though perhaps that could also come under verse memoir. But her 2005 collection, The Time of the Giants, that really is a verse novel, and it's a kind of extended verse novel fairy tale in which the giantess Moss tries to conceal from her lover just how really tall she is. So it's got comedy, but it's also got all sorts of angularity in it too. Anna Jackson's The Gas Leak, 2006, that's more obviously novelistic. This is in 3 sections, and it rewrites a Dutch poem from a feminist point of view, so that we have the prowling gas fitters version told in the 3rd person, but we also have 1st person accounts by his wife and daughter. So there have been some substantial verse novels, including by people on screen. There have been lots of memorable verse sequences, but an interesting variant, recent variant, I think, is what I like to think of as the verse doco, or the documentary in verse. And that's a book-length sequence of poems which tries to reclaim and or reimagine a lost or obscured historical event or person. So there's Chris Orsman's South, 1996, which retells the story of Scott's ill-fated 1910 to 12 expedition to the South Pole. There's Bill Sewell's Erebus, 1999, which, like South, elegizes and meditates on another fatal Antarctic event, the 1979 catastrophe in which the Air New Zealand DC-10 crashed into Mount Erebus and killed everyone on board. Sewell also wrote after this the Ballad of 51, 2003, his last book, and that's a polemical sequence. It's sort of a verse essay, I think you could say, about the deeply shameful 1951 waterfront lockout. You mentioned Robert Sullivan already. I would also sneak in his Casino, City of Martyrs, 2010, which visits and meditates on the site of the Second World War Battle of Monte Cassino, in which Sullivan's grandfather took part. I'd also want to mention Amy Brown's very different Odor of Sanctity, 2013, and this investigates the lives of 6 saints over the past 1700 years in reverse order. So we go from the rock musician Jess Mangum back to the early Christian theologian Aurelius Augustine. You mentioned Irene Beautray. Her Dear Neil Roberts, 2014, comes into this too. This commemorates the 22-year-old anarchist Neil Roberts, who blew himself up outside the police computer center in Whanganui on the 18th of November, 1982. So, that just gives you a little bit of a kind of, a little bit of a summary. Now, the thing about all of these collections is that they tell a story or stories. And John brought this up in what he was saying. So all use what we usually think of as poetic techniques. So shifting verbal registers, formal variety, compressed or abandoned syntax, what Paula Green calls breathy line breaks, calculated use of white space on the page. And these sequences, they all circle around their subject. So they offer provisional responses and evaluations. They embrace contradiction, incongruity, and they weave in all sorts of different kinds of material and different kinds of modes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my 5-minute sprint.
Great. Now, Harry, you co-authored with Paula Green the primer, 99 Ways into New Zealand Poetry.
Yes.
And, our panel tonight may offer ways into New Zealand's poetic stories, and in particular, we hope our panelists' stories in verse. Joan's dystopian verse novel Song of Less, Diane's poetic novella Every Now and Then I Have Another Child, and John's novel in blank verse Escape Path Lighting. Perhaps starting with Joan this time, could our panelists each give a brief synopsis of your story, then read several poems or a poem sequence from the work? So over to you, Joan.
Thanks, Linda. So yes, this is a story that's set after the end of everything. Cities have collapsed and the coasts are impossible, and a group of people have traveled inland into a kind of unnamed desert, and there's a grandmother figure at the center who's magnetized them together into a group of cousins. So essentially it's a post-apocalyptic road story. Very few laughs. There's maybe a couple of laughs, but essentially it's a pretty bleak story. There's, very little water that's not contaminated. There's very little food to subsist on, and there's no hope of rescue. And it's suggested, I suppose, in the text that that these are the endlings, perhaps the last of their species. So I'll read a section and I'll keep an eye on the time out of respect for everyone. I'll read a section in the book that's in the voice of cousin Yana. And this is not the first section of the book, but it's first in the chronology of the story. The moon organizes time by yawning through our scrape along and then yawning again. She glows like the screens we used to know and need. Along we sift till dust 30 and dark in the hollow that used to be a river. Grandmother gathers up the don't berries and thumbs them into the sack. At camp, it is loud with the hot winds. We pass the ear around to hear the night's player. The green desert woods are dressed in shredded packagings. Some of the surviving disguise themselves as gone. We are lucky grandmother knows how to break up these roots for the white grubs they harbor. When we manage a fire, they taste like egg. Remember egg? In Ready by the Sea, I used to keep chickens. How annoyed I was when they escaped and tore up the garden. Now we ourselves have all become something like a beak. Yawning moon sings a song of less as we pitch our windbreak of scrap tin and 7 gutted microwaves. We sleep in a row with grandmother on the outside because she knows the devil's names. The job of someone every day is to carry the instrument or to sit where the instrument is while the rest go scrounging. The hills are dotted with the red blisters we must avoid, and the lilac spears of the trees the heat stripped quiet while we told ourselves a different story. The forgetting comes in heaves like the racing drills of the dust twisters. Tonight it is my turn to play the instrument. I'm charged with California Dreaming, Total Eclipse of the Heart, and a hymn that gets louder before it ends. Asleep, we don't scrounge, but sometimes our dreams do. Grandmother is praying in circles, safe back east, safe back to the water. She has forgotten that no one is going anywhere like that again. Some days the dim sky is scored by whitish trails, but we are not thinking of rescue. I was there when the radius bloomed over the cities. There is nowhere to be rescued to. I haven't talked about the other cousins. Bad days, they tangle. You wouldn't want to see their faces. The cousins help grandmother slow burn the don't berries to make a druggy ash. Every yawning moon we mix it with the altered tobacco and rock and hum in a circle, and we visit our caves. Grandmother sings us through. My heart cave is a velvet painting of stars in which I hang suspended with precious rocks embedded in my skin. It's here I get to see his face again, the rust and pepper of his beard, his split shine eyes. He touches my body like he used to. It hurts and I need it. The don't bury nights are exhausting. Grandmother says they are necessary. The next day, it is always difficult to walk into the hot winds and not keep our eyes shut against them. It could be the thick grey-green water from the compromised well that causes the forgetting. It is our only source. I no longer recognize my hands as those I used to have back in the ready. The muscle all down my right hand back is hard as a boulder from digging in the scrounge. Yesterday, I thought I saw a cat, but it was one of the cousins pulling his bad foot behind him. One night a devil comes. It has pairs of ears all over its head. Grandmother stands up from where we are sleeping in our line and yells its name. She yells and yells. Rage is viscous. It has a human name. It cannot hear her. All its ears are stoppered with a brassy, glinting stuff that sparkles when the devil, advancing, drops to all fours and whips its head like a dog with a sneeze coming. The distance of pale dirt between the devil and the rag pile of the camp beds closes and closes, an asymptote. We are all shaking, unable to look away. Grandmother loses her voice. Yesterday, I thought I saw a bird, but there are all kinds of quick shadows now. I'll leave it there.
Diane.
Sleeping on the job. I wasn't asleep. It's just concentrating on Joan's reading. I'll just start very quickly with 8 Stages of Grace, which basically tells the story of a woman who was married to a Paul Holmes-like character and who has died. And she teaches English to her neighbour who's called Grace. And I think this is based on an actual a student that I actually had when I lived in Auckland. And she told me this dream, so I just wrote it down. So she gave it to me, really, the title. Last night, a special dream for me. I call it 8 Stages of Grief, Grace says, and hesitates. A baby is born, grows into an old man. You love someone, he go away. Grace flutters her hands bird-like. But you live with someone you don't love. She watches me to see if I understand. Her face is tiny, intensely beautiful in its scrutiny. I repeat the words like a mantra. A child grows into an old man. A person you love leaves you. A person you don't lives with you. Right? I ask. Grace, smiling inaccessibly, nods and adds, happiness is a moment. I wonder if she dreamed the 4 other stages, if dreams are different in other languages, if metaphor is untranslatable. So I'm going to leave 8 Stages of Grace there and just move on quickly to every now and then I have another child, which is a very creepy doll on the front. So the premise for this was actually based on a dream I had, which was so extraordinary. I woke up and wrote down this dream straight away. And I think originally it was called Every Now and Then I Have a Child, but then I wanted to invent more than one child, so it became another child. So it begins with this woman who's in Auckland after coming back from overseas. She's a little bit like myself, but she's not myself. She's a writing teacher. And she's in this hotel room. She hears a baby crying. And of course, she takes the baby home with her to Dunedin. So this is a little bit further on and not that far into the book. Who are you? She doesn't have a name. First, I need to comprehend her pale, almost waxy skin. Every now and then, when I think it's time, I try to feed her warm milk, not my own. I've dried up, as expected. What was I thinking, having a baby at my age? Her eyes gaze into mine, as if she's known me forever. Her mouth open, like the antique doll with porcelain face, tangled brown hair, and dark glassy eyes I threw in the fire when my mother disappeared. Who are you? I yell, but she's gone in deep to the other side. To follow her would kill me. There's no oxygen down there. I reel on the brink of the pit, calling out the name I have not given her and do not know. For now, I'll leave her underground and close to my chest, because a character, if not a baby, can be in two places at once, over here and over there. There's a lot about writing in this book, and there's a murder, or is it a murder? There's a doppelganger who turns up. There's all kinds of crazy things. Anyway, so I have the different characters speaking. This is the baby. The unnamed speaks, the baby. See my adopted mother strapping me to her chest in her travelling red pashima, like I'm some kind of trophy, a war medal for breastfeeders. And yet she's 65, the time for mothering long over. Still, she holds me to her empty breast as if an imagination is enough to make me. It's true, the abandonment by her mother, then the absence of a wished-for daughter as a source of much long-buried pain resurfaced since menopause. But that's no reason to wander the streets looking for something that can't be found. And before you tell me what I can or cannot know, I tell you, there are those of us who are born old souls and wise. And I'll just read you a bit of the, can't find it now, a bit of the sequence, which is part of the dream. And this is where the doppelganger turns up. A woman supposedly like me. I take to a bench, my legs trembling. A woman sits down next to me, her hands feeling their way into the pocket of my jacket. Help, I yell. A man who looks a little familiar comes running and squeezes in between us. You two could be sisters, he says. I notice her hard eyes, missing teeth, smoker's skin, hair salted, grey and greasy, a dirty blue jacket and jeans holed at the knees, but not fashionably so. Apart from colouring and being a similar size, I can't see a likeness. Then again, I never recognise myself in mirrors. I'm looking for a driver to get me out of here, the man says. I can't. I have a baby close to my chest, I say. You'll do. He beckons to the woman, and she follows him wordlessly into a dark alley. They disappear from sight, and I turn towards a sliver of light spilling from the hotel foyer. I'll end it there.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Joan. I think I see me now. So my novel, Escape Path Lighting, the tone is going to be a bit different. It's a sort of, it's comic. It's a sort of free-form contemporary satire, comedy of manners. And it's quite hard to summarize because it has a go at virtually, at everything that comes across its bows. But its main target, if I had to pick the key thread out of the novel, is it comes out of a bit of a gripe that I have, a grumble that I have about what I suppose I'll call the creative writing industry, which I mean the teaching of creative writing, in a particular way that the creative writing has come to be taught, and the effect that I think that's had on our literary discourse. What I'm talking, as I say, a particular way of teaching creative writing, I mean the sort of, I suppose, the Iowa tradition, the sort of technocratic approach to teaching creative writing. And I suppose what this my little Jeremiad is trying to do, it's a kind of plea, I suppose, on behalf of a more romantic, more expressive way of thinking about poetry. So anyway, that's basically the main plot line. The setting is a it's set in a sort of generic South Seas paradise, a place called Rock Oyster Island. If anybody knows Waiheke, you may spot a few resemblances. And the main character, who is an elderly poet called Arthur Bardruin, he's been cancelled, basically, not for any kind of moral turpitude, but because his work has been deemed too romantic. And what happens in the sort of dystopian world is that when your work is found wanting by this organisation known as the Continence Police, they send you for re-education to the sort of drying out centre called the Isle of Drunks. And rather than submit to this, this character Arthur Bardruin fakes his own death by drowning and washes up quite literally on the shores of Rock Oyster Island. And there he is taken in by a kindly Earth Mother, and who shelters him. And he goes into hiding and he starts writing again. And he writes his epic poem, which of course turns out to be this epic poem. And that's that line of the story. Having said that, there are an awful lot of characters in it. There's a list of them at the front. I tallied them up. There's 41 characters who make it onto the sort of list of dramatis personae, and there's 8 main characters. When I read from it, I always read from the first chapter, really, because otherwise there's too much sort of backstory. It's too complicated. You have to kind of explain too much, because there's always things happening. You know, it's very plotty. But the opening chapter, which is where I always read from, I do it's actually a gesture that I've borrowed from, stolen from Under Milkwood. There's a sequence in Under Milkwood where Dylan Thomas does a kind of sort of flyover of the village at night, and he sort of looks down into all the different homes and you know, to see what all the various characters are doing. And so I use that device to introduce all the main characters and also to introduce the sort of main localities in which the drama is going to unfold, all of which have various sort of symbolic values. So I'll read you a couple of those. I'll read right from the beginning, and then if depending on how long that takes, I might read another one or two as well. Just a few of these sort of these vignettes from the opening chapter. So this is if you open this novel, this is where it begins. How much Manfred Singleton can see is subject to dispute. No one on sleepy Rock Oyster Island has ever observed him without his shades. Cumbersome Aristotle Onassis numbers with lenses like the butt ends of plus-sized Heinekens. Mind you, Manfred keeps to himself. He's not the sort of person you meet at the store. Talk to the locals, you'll learn there's a lot not to know about him. Like where he got $4 million, give or take, for a concrete monstrosity by Richwhite and Crotch. Like whether the god-awful squealing noise that he pipes from a sound system hidden in the spinifex really is some kind of difficult music, or just meant to scare the little shits who throw stones on his roof. Cranky old Manfred, where would the gossips and the Bally-High tea rooms be without him? Just as well, really, they can't see him now. What kind of creep, they might plausibly ask, needs to wear military night vision goggles to stare at himself in a mirror in a darkened room? A room that resembles an underground bunker, or some dire modernist concert hall, off-form concrete, mean leather couches, electronic keyboards, a mixing desk, and a portable clothes rack on which he first tidily hangs up his jacket and Hugo Boss shirt, then wheels aside to gaze neutrally at the insensate void where his breasts used to be. No one would call him a clubbable fellow. You can't blame the locals for having their doubts. But fear not, amiable reader. Manfred sees everything. So that's Manfred Singleton. And then you get who's the sort of frame narrator. And then you get a cut and carries on. On the darkened headland across the bay at the Blue Pacific Wellness Farm, scented tea lights and thick glass tumblers burn on the doorsteps of 24 cedar chalets. In 500 thread count Egyptian cotton, the worried well sleep their dreamless sleep. The well-fed, the well-stretched, the well-scrubbed and mud-bathed and rubbed and exfoliated, punctured and pampered, heard and affirmed, the chakra balanced, the colonically irrigated. Only the patients of Juanita Diaz, Annalista Lacaniana, late of Buenos Aires by way of Melbourne, Australia, enjoy visitations through the Gate of Horn, and so forth and so on. So that's the Blue Pacific Wellness Farm, which is where all sorts of new age nonsense goes on, including the teaching of creative writing. That's one of the necessary sort of forms of self-care that is offered at this one-stop wellness shop. Then we meet the Earth Mother I mentioned. Her name is Marigold Ingle, the one who's going to take in Arthur Bardram when he washes up on her beach. And I'll just read one more sequence. It cuts then to the local tavern, the local entertainment centre, a place called the Sandgroper Lounge, and we meet a woman called, whose name I've temporarily forgotten, whose name is Bridget O'Dwyer. So this is Bridget. As the evening winds down at the Sandgroper Lounge, the action reverts to the pleasure craft moored offshore. Come and party with us, babe, the punters implore as they trip from the bar, the pleasantry aimed at a comely young woman with a glossy black bob, a short leather skirt, and a t-shirt announcing, "Hi, I'm Bridget, the midget brain." The foxy bar manager waves each away in a tone that takes stock of their relative charms. "Don't tempt me, sweetheart. Ask me tomorrow. Fuck off, Simon, you gobshite," and sundry variations. Shortly, from under the waterfront palm trees, a zippy flotilla of tenders discharges, conveying the revellers to their floating digs, which rock together gently, lit up like a matchstick city. Ahead lie the customary late-night bouts of skinny dipping and haute cuisine, ruinous card games, beer and narcotics, and creepy, athletic, rich person sex. Bridget, meanwhile, squares off the tills, locks the night's take in the wall safe, and closes up behind her. And so on. Let me leave it there, and let's carry on with the conversation. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Joan, Diane, John. Your work certainly exemplify the diverse ways of storytelling through poetry. Obviously in form, Joan's, yours, Song of Less in prose poems, and Diane, your 8 Stages of Grace alternates a longish line with a shorter indented one, whereas in your poetic novella, it varies according to speaker. And John, your Escape Path Lighting utilizes a loose blank verse with each line defaulting to 10, but as you say, it contracts and expands as necessary. Your works use different modes to modify presentation and differ in their subgenre conventions. Joan's speculative, Diane's often deemed elegiac, and John's, yours is comic. And the structures differ too. Yours has got 12 sections. Escape Path Lighting comprises 3 books with 18 chapters overall, plus John, your coda and dramatis personae. And Diana's poetic novella has a prologue and epilogue, 9 sections, and 108 poems in between. And particularly interestingly, each of your stories nuances its poetry to differentiate between your characters or speakers. So I suppose, Harry, first of all, some broader context compared to earlier New Zealand poetic works. How would you consider contemporary New Zealand storytelling in poetry to be breaking boundaries in relation to form or voice?
Well, I think you've half answered the question already, Linda, with your very apt summing up of our 3 readers. I think what I'd say is that, and John will know this as well as I do, up until pretty recently, the New Zealand poetry world was very male, very Pākehā. And one of the huge differences in the last 20 years, thankfully, is that we are now in a much more diverse cultural context. And so, you know, there's a real plurality of voices, and you hear that in these novels that we're hearing snippets of tonight, and in, you know, the ones that I listed earlier. So there's much more diversity. There's all kinds of voices, including non-binary voices. There's lots of technical experimentation, adventurousness, different subject matter. It's not just a matter of form and voice. There's different subject matter being attended to, and that's very exciting, I think. So it's not just that the perspectives on offer are much broader, but also the kinds of stories that we're being introduced to, the kind of worlds that we're being taken into in these fictions, quasi-fictions, verse docos, is just something that it would have been hard to find even 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating and complex too, how these writers, be they verse novelists or verse novellas, how they've differentiated in poetic form and voice, and in all these other ways, their respective characters, poem speakers and narrators. So let's hear shortly Joan, how Joan in Song of Less differentiates the voice of Yana, cousin Frogmouth, cousin Butcher, and even the don't berries, which as an all-seeing force of toxic mutations still exercises character agency. Then we'll hear from Diane about those characters we heard, Ruth and Grace, in the verse novel, and also some more about the narrator character Joanna, and the baby speaker, the boy speaker, and the doppelganger in her verse novella. And then John, would be delighted if you'd elaborate on the different choices made for the narrator versus the characters in your work, and the intended effects of those choices. So circling back to Joan to start, and the question once more. So how did you differentiate in poetic form and voice, Joan, your respective characters, poem speakers or narrator?
Thanks, Linda. I mean, essentially, these cousins sort of just arrived in my brain and started speaking to me. I didn't begin the writing of that book with a narrative in mind, or even a world in mind, really. It started with a prose poem chunk that I thought was a standalone poem, and more chunks arose and began to glom onto that, and I realized it was, you know, a voice, and then more characters' voices kind of arose and suggested themselves to me. It was, yeah, very, very intuitive process. There was some conscious decisions I made about sort of formatting the voices on the page. You know, Yana speaks in these kind of prose chunks, and cousin Frogmouth is in couplets, and cousin Butcher, who's named after the butcher bird, his voice kind of fragments all over the page. And yeah, Linda, you mentioned the don't berries. That's the one sonnet in the book. It seemed strange at first that this anarchic, non-human, kind of hallucinogenic, all-seeing, kind of immortal force might resolve into, you know, a strict Shakespearean sonnet, but so be it, was the way it had to be. But yes, it's, for me, it's very difficult to talk about my own craft and kind of decisions of voice and poetic. So yeah, I appreciate the question, but I'll leave that to the critics. Yeah.
It seems more intuitive. What about you, Diane?
Yes, just a word to just backing up what Harry said. I can't really talk about it in any detail, but I'm judging the Ockham Poetry Award this year, one of the judges, and there are 45 books in total that have been published this year, and it's such an extreme, you know, I was completely blown away by the diversity of it, the different forms, and quite a lot of sort of prose poems in these in a lot of these works. So it's a very, very difficult job. But anyway, that's a side issue. So the different, how I differentiated in poetic form, I didn't really in 8 Stages of Grace. It's really just trying to think of the main character's name now. It's such a long time since I wrote it. Ruth. It's really all her voice, completely her voice. So by the time, so that was relatively simple, but I do have a lot of characters speaking in it. And every now and then I have another child. As I said, it started off with this dream with the baby arriving, and then the doppelganger. And then probably most strangely is the woman peels a boy off the wall, off a mural, and takes him home. He's a bit inadequate as a child because he's 2-dimensional, and so he doesn't get up and walk. So she has to haul him around in a pushchair. He's about 8. So it's based on a real mural down the road from us, and it's such a fabulous mural that I just had to steal him away. So I had to try and give them different voices. So primarily I just use form. So the main character, Joanna, she sort of speaks in quite articulate, I suppose, stanzas of 5 lines each, with the last line indented. The baby speaks in 3-line stanzas, so trying to sort of narrow it down, getting it a bit more concise. And the doppelganger speaks in a short line, in a long line, short line, long line, without breaks, because the doppelganger is kind of more urgent and aggressive in her approach to Joanna, who doesn't really know, even actually by the end of the book, whether she's real or a figment of Joanna's imagination. Yeah, so it was a lot of experimentation, and like Joan says, I think it is quite difficult to talk about these things, that often reviewers or critics can take a more global opinion about it.
And what about you, John?
Just unmute myself. It was kind of you Linda, to say that I differentiate between my speakers. I'm not sure in a way though that I do all that much. I mean there is some differentiation in certain cases, and there is a very dominant narrative voice, which is somewhat elevated above the other voices. But in a way, I didn't particularly want to differentiate the way between the way that my different characters speak. I was sort of quite happy for them all to speak in the same way. It's the thing about it. The point being, from my point of view, that it's a comic world, and it's a kind of, I talked about it being dystopian before, but that refers to sort of the world, the larger setting. But the community on Rock Oyster Island is really a utopian community. It's a sort of beatnik, slacker sort of utopia, where everybody is literate and everybody is witty and everybody writes poetry and everybody quotes poetry at the drop of a hat. you know, from the local storekeeper to the policeman to the, you know, the people down at the drag strip and so forth and so on. Everybody takes drugs, and that, you know, that's the sort of utopian dimension of it. That in a way, it's a kind of, it's a sort of fantasy of tolerance, if you like, and that in a way is the reason that I don't really want to differentiate between the characters. You know, it's, a lot of the comedy relies on the sort of, you know, the likeness of sort of unlikely pairings of characters, and of course it's underlined by the fact that because everybody is speaking blank verse, sort of underlines the sense that everybody is speaking the same language, and that's really kind of what I wanted. I didn't really want the sort of the realist differentiation between characters. I wanted the sort of the sort of stagey, artificial sort of effect that allowed, you know, that allowed all the characters to sort of meet on the same plane and the same sort of regime. So that got me off the hook again, trying to differentiate them.
No, fantastic. I'm wondering if perhaps rather than the differences, we consider some of the shared features of these poetic stories. Given that genre is in part a matter of belonging, and belonging comes about by sharing familiar norms. Obviously, your works share familiar norms. Each has a story world, a sequence of time-linked events, characters mediated from particular perspectives through acts of utterance or articulation. And these narrative elements at least make the story recognisable as a story. And then poetic elements such as metaphors, alliteration, types of rhyme, rhythmic, syllabic and visual patterning, white space, which can be read for meaning, and segmentation, I think Harry mentioned earlier, that can shape and impact meaning at word level, line level, stanza level, and so on. And yet, you know, these elements aren't mere decoration. They inflect and nuance every aspect of your works. Yet, nor are the elements always the same or uniformly applied. So it must require a good deal of trial and error, I imagine, of problem solving. Perhaps let's start with you again, John, and can each of you in turn recall particular problem-solving decisions you had to make in the writing process?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. You'd signaled that you were going to ask me that, and so I thought about it a bit in advance. And there certainly are some problems that I solved, but I think what I'd rather talk about is the problem that I can't solve. And there's a problem in the first novel that defeats me. And I don't know whether anybody else recognises this, so I'd be interested to hear if anybody does. But you know, the lovely thing about writing narrative verse is that it's friendly and it's welcoming and it's easy to listen to. And I don't know about anybody else, but whenever I'm listening to poetry being read aloud, I always utter a small prayer of thanks whenever anybody starts reading narrative, because it's always so easy to easy to listen to. You don't have to concentrate so hard. You've got a story that carries you along. So it's reader friendly in that sense. But I guess the price of that reader friendliness is that it generates sort of assumptions in the reader that, you know, the assumption, I guess, that story is all there is. Once people start reading for story, it's hard for them to remember to read for anything else. And so I find myself in a bit of a quandary, because I was sort of raised as a modernist, and I want people to read closely, and I want people to read in depth and so on. So I'm sort of I want people to read slowly, I suppose, but narrative sort of encourages people to read fast. So I'm sort of asking, you know, my ideal reader would read in two different ways with sort of two different kinds of attention. But I've got no idea how you encourage or persuade people to actually do that. I don't think it happens. You know, in a fantasy world, they would read it once quickly and then they would read it again slowly. But that's a problem with what I'm trying to do that I haven't begun to resolve. So if anybody else knows how to resolve it, I'd love to hear.
Yes, the narrative propels us forward, and the poetry asks us to pause and
exactly
take it in. What about you, Diane and Joan? Problem solving, tricky things with your verse novels.
Yes, I agree with John really, because sometimes I think, oh, well, people haven't really recognised how long it's taken to actually, that there is a lot of work put into getting the poetics right, but as John says, people mostly concentrate on the story, and I don't know what the answer is unless you have a big notice on the front of the book. Please read this once for the story, and then read it again for the words and the poetry. Would that work? Yes, I had I had a lot of problems to do with structure, to do with, I fiddled around a lot with form one way or another, and I remember just saying, every day I would, read write a little bit, and then I'd read it aloud, and then the next day I'd read it again, and then I'd have to change, because it didn't quite fit, the form wasn't right. And I sort of thought, why am I doing all this? It's much more time consuming than just writing sentences, I'm sure. But in the end, it's kind of fascinating, and I love that, the structure of it. And it's sort of like a mathematical puzzle in a way, which is really great. But it's not that easy to do. And I had to get rid of some characters because it was just becoming too cumbersome. So, Joanna has a husband, and I got rid of him. Oh, my husband's just joined, actually. Sort of, lurking in the other room. I've just noticed. So that was the main thing, and also trying to figure out for myself exactly what was happening in this work, because I had no idea, and because I was just letting the characters lead me. But in the end, you get there.
Yeah, and Joan, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. Yes, I've just been pondering John's phrasing of the problem of poetry. I don't think I have any solutions for how troublesome poetry is, but I, continue to be a devotee to, poetry's origins as oration and song and incantation. The poet Alice Oswald seems to get around it by always reading whatever she's reading twice. She will often sort of read it and then repeat it to kind of give it a moment to sink in. And there's the Greek Australian anarchist poet Pio, who we had to read at a recent series that I put on here in Nam, and he kind of plants his feet shoulder length and just shouts, and there's just no space in your brain for anything else to happen. Your mind cannot wander. You are just in his thrall. So repetition or shouting, that's all I can sort of suggest, but it doesn't solve the problem of being kind of drawn along by the narrative. But yeah, in terms of problem solving for Song of Less, one of the problems that I was wrestling with was the problem of time. So in the narrative, there's no way to keep track of time. There's no clocks, and one of the effects of the fallout of the radius, it's called the event, is that seasons have basically been done away with, and nor is there kind of the brightness of day or the darkness of night. Time is kind of this stretching, kind of purblind, undifferentiated kind of mass that these people are living in. And they, you have the yawning moon that comes, I suppose, every 28 days. But yeah, it was like one of the questions that was asked of an earlier draft was, you know, how long has passed since these people have been in this desert? How many years have gone by? And my poet friend who asked the question, it was actually Amy Brown, the author of Odor of Sanctity, which has been mentioned. Yeah, she said, I think it might be necessary maybe to know how many years have passed, because, you know, this group of people they've taken on new names, they've taken on a new kind of conception of self-identity, a new conception of social responsibility, you know, new rituals, and, you know, they're knotted together by this kind of new mini society. And I think she kind of at that point wanted to sort of know, like, how long does that take? Does it take a long time? And as I reflected on this, and, you know, I reflected on my own experiences of being uprooted or uprooting myself into really, really different cultural contexts, and sort of reflecting on how long does it take before your brain changes and you acclimatize to a really different cultural context. And I think the answer is not that long. I mean, my main experience of this is, you know, going to live in camp and in community with Walpri families in Yundamu and in Europe. And yeah, it doesn't take long before, you know, conceptions of obligation and sharing and belongings, what belongs to you and what belongs to everyone. It doesn't take long before your conception of money and spending money and keeping money is really changed. So yeah, in the end, the way that I solved that problem of time, how much time has gone past, was just to leave it and not say one way or the other how much time had gone by, to leave it open, and and just to be firm in my conviction that humans are very malleable, and our brains are elastic, and our senses of ourselves are elastic, and given the right conditions, you know, we can change and we can adapt. And we've seen that, you know, in the past couple of years. Another problem is a problem of structure. I wrote this story chronologically, but at some point my editor suggested that we put the last section first. And I think that was because he's quite taken with the language of that section. I think it had his favorite language moments. And yeah, but that suggestion was kind of like lightning striking, because I realized that by shaping the story like a kind of Ouroboros and having the time loop, it was a formal way of reflecting a kind of thematics of looping that's happening within the story, and not to give anything too much away. Yeah, at the story's end, the cousins find a way to speak backwards, because there's no forwards, there's no future generations coming, there's no future to look to, so they turn around and they speak backwards, and they storytell backwards. And that is actually the only way for them to transcend impotence in this book. Yeah, and that, yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joan. Look, these complexities are ones that we have to grapple with when we deal with these forms. Joan, you've spoken about the verse novel as being the most underrated form in the world, and John, you've commented in interview, the verse novel is a huge mountain to climb, and if you get to the top, there's probably no one there to notice. Well, recently, poet and professor Sarah Holland-Batt repurposed the Australian anthem's first line to pose this challenge to the nation: Australians all, let us read verse. So I thought perhaps panelists in turn, to finish up, a brief response, starting with Harry. What might you say to New Zealanders to promote reading verse novels and other stories in poetry? Or what other interventions, programs or ideas could you suggest to support these works?
Okay, thanks. Very briefly, I would encourage more local poets, Pakeha, Maori, Pacifica, to try writing verse novels, verse sequences and verse docos. There are lots of subjects which would certainly draw readers. 1981 Springbok Tour and the enormously powerful feelings that it generated, that would be a great subject. The Sinking of the Rainbow Warrior by the French, 1985, that would be a good subject. We're living in a time of reclaiming and re-examining the past, and I think that offers local poets an amazing opportunity to write extended narratives in whatever kind of verse they find suits them best. And those stories don't, of course, have to be exclusively local or Pacific-based, as Amy Brown's Odor of Sanctity reminds us. So I'd start by encouraging the poets, and Pache, what John said about creative writing programs, I would encourage creative writing programs to try and get poets to attempt novels. Generous competition prizes, there are short story prizes. Why not, verse novel prizes? If poets write verse novels, then readers will read them. One of the challenges might be, and you mentioned Vikram Seth's The Golden Gate earlier, and also Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, and behind that there's Byron's Beppo and Don Juan. I think a real technical challenge now would be to try and write a verse novel in rhyme that worked. The Australian novelist first novelist I've got in mind, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Linda, Alan Wien, the Love Makers, that has got so many varied forms in it. It's such a witty piece of work. And one of the things that potentially rhymed verse allows for is wit. And it's one of the great page-turning elements of Vikram Seth's The Golden Gate. So witty, be the DJ of your fate, as one of the lines says. So, yeah, that would be my little plug.
Fantastic. What about you, John and Diane?
It's good to hear Harry being so upbeat about it. I think I'm going to be the skeleton at the feast a bit. I do think it's we are talking about a minority taste within a minority taste. A niche genre within a niche genre, if you know what I mean. So I think we possibly have to be a wee bit realistic. When Escape Path Lighting came out, I was, as one sometimes does, feeling, the usual grumpy things about not getting enough attention. Why isn't everybody making more fuss, and so forth and so on? And why isn't everybody lining up to buy it? And I was talking to the editor of one of our review outlets, since we don't have very many review outlets in New Zealand anymore. It's probably not too hard to guess who I was talking to. But anyway, I was saying to this gentleman rather grumpily, why didn't you? I thought you quite liked my stuff. Why didn't you review my book? And he said to me, "Oh, I thought it was a novel in verse." That's the end of the conversation. So, I would, I think Harry should be making the rules instead. I think that'd be much better.
Shall I follow on from that? Yes, I agree. I agree with John. I'm a little bit sour about the sort of reaction to verse novels, really, in New Zealand. I think possibly one of my inspirations for doing it in the first place was because I really wanted to make poetry more attractive to people who don't read poetry. So I thought, if I put it into a verse novel, then they might see it's not so scary. But then I heard about booksellers who said that they would watching people pick up one of my books and they notice that it's in poetry and then they closed it again because it is scary. So I think that it seems to me that there's a lot more publishing of verse novels and a lot more attention given to them in Australia. And I was thinking about this question and wondering if we have very few prizes that, like Harry was talking about. We only really have the Ockham, and it's not just a problem for verse novelists. For instance, I noticed that things like memoirs kind of get overlooked because of the great number of general non-fiction books. So a small, slim memoir hardly ever gets recognised in the prize list. So it's that there's nowhere for these books to fit. I mean, my 8 Stages of Grace was longlisted for the prize, whatever it was called then. I think it was the Montana. So that was quite unusual at the time. And it sold reasonably well, I think, but no better than a novel, that's for sure. And so, and I agree with John, they're very rarely reviewed because I think the people that organise the review pages just don't know where they fit. And so they don't get reviewed, so people don't know about them in the first place. I'm not quite sure what the answer is, really. Maybe if a lot more people write them, then they will create their own audience, if you like. But it's the same with poetry. I mean, primarily the people who are buying poetry books are poets themselves, I think. Yeah, so it's a difficult one, but you know, they could like people that do festivals, writing festivals, could actually step outside of their little bubbles and actually, you know, why don't they have sessions on verse novels, for instance? They very rarely do, you know. So those things would help.
Great. And just briefly, Joan, you?
Yeah, I've been meditating on this question. Yeah, I do think it's an underrated form, and maybe there's nothing wrong with being the underdog. But I did have an idea, actually. You know, I think of poetry's kind of sister genre as being kind of the discontinuous essay or the lyric essay, and maybe one of the sister genres of the verse novel is the play. And so I had this vision of you know, verse novelists reaching out to, you know, our dramaturg mates and our theater people and creating, you know, a mini festival where, with some minimal staging and the help of directors, we do read-throughs of verse novels in a kind of mini festival. I don't have capacity to make that happen right away, but yeah, that occurred to me and I thought that would be fantastic.
Yeah, it is already starting to happen, Joan. Jerry Kroll's work, Jeff Page's work, and a number of works overseas as well. So more on that. Look, I'm ever the optimist. So I take on board all your ideas and let's hope to see them happen in coming years. Thank you all so much, panelists. Hopefully our audience feels inspired, and let's hope we can get some further ideas from them now. I'm going to bounce back to Sophia, ready for Q&A, but thank you all very much again.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was absolutely fantastic. I think hearing insights about the form itself and Harry's sort of words about the difference in language and the structure of language in a verse novel as opposed to a novel, and then hearing your excerpts and some of your experiences was really, I think everyone here would agree, was really brilliant. So just, we are running a little short on time, but we do have time for some questions. So does anybody have anything that they would like to ask while we have all these wonderful panelists here before we go? Can't see anyone's hand up, so I'm assuming that's a, just wave hard if there's anyone there.
Oops.
I actually have just a very basic, probably naive question to ask, which was what, and it to any of you, but what put your work into the direction of a verse novel as opposed to poetry or a novel? Like, how did you decide to write in that genre, or did the work just flow out that way? Diane?
Sorry. It just sort of happened. I think for my 8 stages of grace, I just set myself a challenge to do it. I don't know why. I had read Dorothy Porter's Monkey Mask, which I thought was terribly exciting. I thought, oh, I wonder if I could do something like that, which it's nothing like that, but yeah, so it was just seemed to be the right thing to do. And what I wanted to add, despite all my pessimism about getting recognised, all that kind of stuff, I have to say that I absolutely love writing in this form. I love the discipline involved in it. And so I'll keep writing regardless of whether you get recognition or not, because that seems to me the thing to do. Yeah.
Fantastic, Diane. And I think, you know, even things like this and sharing the word about verse novels is a good step, isn't it? In educating people about the verse novels that are out there, and the genre is good. Bring it into schools. And yes, Linda.
Yeah, look, just in follow-up to the questions about prizes and awards, obviously globally an increasing number of verse novels have won or been shortlisted for awards and prizes. From the very highest awards, and I'm talking cross-category here, children's, YA and adult, but highest awards, premiers, prime ministers, to the independent and bookseller and industry awards. And part of my research involves specifically finding out whether verse novels are eligible. So I asked Joy Salon, administrator for the New Zealand Book Awards for children and young adults, to clarify the eligibility, and her response was that verse novels would be considered to be eligible for entry into the Wright Family Foundation Esther Glenn Award for Junior Fiction, the Young Adult Fiction Award, and the Best First Book Award, provided they meet all the other eligibility criteria for the categories. Their criteria doesn't specifically mention verse novels, but if the books in question are aimed at the relevant age groups, there's no reason why they can't be entered. And similarly, the publisher at Otago University Press, Sue Wooten, provided some clarification regarding the Kathleen Grattan Prize. And she said there's nothing to prohibit a verse novel or novella being entered for the Grattan Award. In the event that the entry won the award, they'd consider it for publication. And she said, I fully expect and hope that the award will always attract entrants who push at the boundaries of poetic form and genres. So, yes, to follow up to, with Harry's advice, please, across all categories, do consider giving it a go. Thank
I
you.
could just jump in for a moment on Sophia's question. The reason that I wanted to write a verse novel was it goes back to the time that I spent in Australia. I was in Australia in the early 90s through to the mid 90s, and when I don't know if that was the height of the verse novel boom in Australia, but it's been a much more prominent genre in Australia. It was particularly in that period, and it was really that experience of the way that it was treated over there that inspired me to want to write one. And I've sort of wanted to do one ever since that time, and finally found a way of doing it. But I think it's kind of interesting that really the only reason we're all here doing this panel is thanks to Linda, who's done this book from Australia and has got us in New Zealand talking about the verse novel. So thank you, Linda. That's wonderful. But it also says something about the relative status of the genre on both sides of the Tasman. I'm not quite sure how it caught on or why it caught on in the way that it did in Australia. Linda might have ideas about that, but something's happened there that's never quite happened here, but it's just spilling over here a little bit as we speak. Let's hope.
Maybe it's about to happen.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. I think it's probably time to wrap up if we're all finished. I thank you very much, Linda, for moderating this salon and for instigating it and bringing everyone together. Thanks, Michelle, for coordinating everybody, and thank you all panelists and audience for being here. I'll just do a really short karakia to end with. Unihi, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapu nui, kia wātea, kia mama, tēnāko te tinana, te wairua I te ara tangata, koia rā e rongo, whakairea, ake ki rongorongo, kia tina, hui e, tai ki e. Thanks, everybody.
Kia ora.
Thanks, Sophia.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Linda. Thank you, everybody.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks and good night.